Good evening, everyone. My name is Anne Chisholm. I'm the chair of the Royal Society of Literature, and it's really thrilling for me to see all of you here at the Peacock Theatre this evening for our biggest ever literary event. There was a moment earlier this year when we wondered if we were taking a risk in arranging a venue more than 3 times as large as those where we usually hold our talks. But we soon realised, as 1,000 tickets went in a flash, that with Neil Gaiman on the programme, we really needn't have worried. We are hugely grateful to him for agreeing to be here, to his publishers, Headline, for their support, and above all, to our media partner, The Guardian newspaper. Just a quick word about the Royal Society of Literature. People sometimes think, because of our impressive title, that we may be a touch pompous and exclusive. I do assure you, and you can see, because you're here tonight, that we really are not. Membership and all our events, about 24 a year, are open to everyone, and we're especially keen to welcome younger readers. Our staff are around outside with more information about us and how to join, and they'll be delighted to help, or please check us out on our website. Our autumn programme will be announced soon, and among the speakers coming up, there will be Julian Barnes, Yung Chang, Roddy Doyle, Margaret Drabble, Ian McEwan, Camilla Shampsey, and Ali Smith. In conversation with Neil Gaiman this evening is Claire Armitstead, who for some years was literary editor of The Guardian and its outstanding review section, having previously been a reporter, a theatre critic, and arts editor. She's one of our best-known literary and cultural commentators on radio and television, as well as in print and online. For the last couple of years, she's been head of books, not just of The Guardian, but of The Observer, and the online edition as well, and is thus in charge of book-related material for some 38 million readers worldwide. She has boundless enthusiasm for using all the huge potential of the digital age and new media to spread the word about good books and good writers as widely as possible, which makes her the perfect person to talk to Neil Gaiman, whose work ignores boundaries and sets readers of all ages alight on our behalf. And I'm delighted now to hand over to her. Claire.
And welcome. I don't think that Neil needs much introduction to most of you, although what I am aware of is that you will all come with your own reading passions, because Neil is a writer who is also many writers, and the Sandman fans are not necessarily the same fans who grew up reading Coraline, not necessarily the same fans who grew up with came into him with American Gods. I've got a bit of a feedback here. Can you hear a whistle back on my mic, or is it all right?
No, you're definitely whistling.
I've got a whistle. This sort of thing happens with Neil. Some of you may be aware that on Friday he came and spent a day. He took over the Guardian Books website for a day, and the website went down. All our tools went down. And we were in fact, Neil was the only, because we were not working with the background tools, Neil was the only bit at lunchtime that was working on the whole of The Guardian. So what's a little bit of whistle between friends? Anyway, I'm going to
They were very baffled. I mean, it was kind of fun. Everyone was going, well, I'm not working. Are you working? No, I'm not working. And I'm going, it's fine here.
Typing away. And he managed to, we think, do the most active ever live web chat. You've got something like 85 questions in an hour, which shouldn't be humanly possible. So I'm rather wondering whether you've been taken over by a flea or something. But he also started off a short story, which is still running on the web. And we've had something like 350 short stories submitted over the last few days from an opening line that Neil gave us. And so if any of you go away and you're hungry for more at the end of this, which I'm sure you will, go and
write a short story. It was really lucky that the website went down. At the moment it went down, and in the way that it went down, because the original plan had been this thing that actually has happened, enough times before that it's familiar with the web, where somebody tweets a first line or puts up a first line, and then somebody else comes and does another line, and lots of people sort of doing lines, and someone is picking them and putting them in, and gradually this sort of exquisite corpse kind of story gets constructed. But in this case, I put up my line, and the website went down. which meant that nobody was throwing up things and people just went off and wrote short stories inspired by the thing. And once the website went up, about 45 minutes later, they started putting them up. And we just looked at it and went, actually, this is so much cooler than the thing that we'd planned.
So can you remember what the line was? I can.
What was it?
It wasn't just murder, he decided. Everything else seemed to have conspired to ruin his day as well. Even, you're missing the punchline, even the cat.
It was fun. That was actually written in the car on the way over to The Guardian. And I looked down and saw an email saying, where is the first line? And I thought it would be fun to do something that didn't sound like a Neil Gaiman first line, and that sort of set a tone and seemed kind of funny, and also didn't have any magical weirdness in it, or almost none.
Well, except for the cat. You never know with cats, do you?
You never know with cats. Cats are mysterious.
No. But we're here today to talk about his book, which is being published on Tuesday, The Ocean at the End of the Lane. And we have actually got a live blogger up in the box, and so I will be trying to do this thing of taking questions as they come in online. So if any of you have got a tweeting or anything, we might be able to pick them up. And I'm not just going to, we're going to have roving mics for a large part of this, but I will also be putting in live questions as they arrive. But first, it's me. I get to ask the questions. Tell us about The Ocean at the End of the Lane.
Okay, so The Ocean at the End of the Lane is the first novel I've ever written completely 100% entirely accidentally. Every other time I've written a novel, I knew I was going to be writing a novel. I knew what kind of a novel it was going to be. I knew the shape of the book. And then I went off and wrote it. I knew that Stardust was going to be a thin book that would feel like a fairy tale. I knew that American Gods was going to be something the size and shape of a brick, and that it would be a big, rambling thing. I knew that Anansi Boys was going to be a funny book of a sort of kind of length of a bit longer than a P.G. Wodehouse novel, because that was the kind of thing I wanted to make. With The Ocean at the End of the Lane, it was last year, and my wife, the inestimable Amanda Palmer, had gone off to, thank you, she is very whistle-worthy, had gone off to Melbourne, Australia. And she had gone to Melbourne to make an album, which she eventually did make, and it was called, she finished, it was called Theatre is Evil. And I didn't expect really to have a problem with this. I thought, I'll go off and write. And then I discovered that when your wife goes off to make an album, she winds up with another relationship with the album that she's making that kind of excludes you. And I actually understood this, because I'm pretty much like that when I'm doing a novel. I just batten down the hatches, and everybody else in my life just sort of shrugs and waits for me to come back out again. But in this case, I was really missing Amanda. And she was gone. She was sending me happy texts, telling me how her album was going. And that was about it. And I thought, I miss her. I thought, I'll write her a short story. That's what I'll do. And some years ago, about 2003, I bought a Mini. And I really liked the Mini. I loved things about it, like the fact that I was in proportion to the new Minis out there, roughly the same size that I, as a small boy, had been to our little Mini. I thought there was a glorious consistency to that. And I remember just talking with my dad. He'd come out to America. We were talking about Minis and about the Mini, and I said, you know, you used to have that lovely little white Mini that was your car, and then it was my mum's car, and I loved that car. Why did you get rid of it? And he went, ah. Yeah, I've never told you that story, have I? And I said, no, you never have. And he said, well, we had a lodger. And he was South African. He'd come over from South Africa and he smuggled out lots of money with him from his friends that he'd promised to bank in England for them. Because at that time you could only take like £100 out of South Africa. So he had lots of money with him. And he came to England, and he discovered the casino in Brighton. And initially, first he lost all his money. Then he only planned to dip into his friend's money until he'd made his money back. And then he didn't have anything. And he drove the car, came home, stole our car, drove it down to the bottom of the lane, and killed himself in it. And I thought, what? And he said, yep, I sold that car that afternoon. I knew your mother was never going to get in it ever again. And that was the end of that car. And my reaction to this anecdote was not sorrow for somebody who had died. It was instead this sort of weird 7-year-old resentment that something interesting had happened that I hadn't known about. And I thought, that's sort of absolutely fascinating to me. This thing happened, and I was the kind of kid who was always going, well, interesting things happen in books, but nothing happens in real life. And something had happened, and I hadn't known. So that sort of sat there in the back of my head, and I kept thinking, wouldn't it be interesting if I had known? Would that have been a story? Where would the story have gone? And then Amanda was away, and I missed her, and I thought, I'll do a story. And I'll do Amanda a story. And she doesn't really like fantasy very much. But she likes me. And when I tried taking her to places that I'd lived before and just to show her what they looked like, I kept having to go, but this isn't actually what it was like when I lived here, because now they've built houses all over it, whatever. So I thought, I'll take not the family, but the landscape of the world I grew up in. And I will have a character who is a lot like a 7-year-old Neil. He lives in books a lot. And I'll set it in that landscape, and it will be a short story, and then I'll send it to Amanda, and then she'll be happy that I've done this thing for her. And then I will get on with the real work that I'm meant to be doing while here in Florida, like writing an episode of Doctor Who that makes the Cybermen scary and the other stuff I'm meant to be doing. So that was my plan. And it was a really good plan. And after several weeks, I looked around and went, I don't think this is a short story. It's a novelette. They're about 10,000 words. It'll be one of those. And somewhere in the middle of the following week, I thought, well, it's obviously a novella. And then I kept writing it. A few weeks later, I sent an email to my lovely editor, Jane Morpeth, over here, and my editor, Jennifer Brell, in America, saying, I just need to warn you, I appear to be writing a novella. I have no idea what we'll do with it once it's done, but just so you know, there's this thing that I'm working on. And then I kept writing it. Amanda finished her album. She came to Dallas to mix her album, and I flew in, and I spent the first couple of days sitting in coffee shops, just finishing the book. And then I started typing it. And every night, I would read her what I'd written before bed. And then she'd fall asleep. And I really didn't, and I tell people that story, and they go, weren't you upset? It's like, no, I loved it. And she'd wake up the next morning, I'd say, okay, where do you remember up to? And she'd tell me, and I'd start a bit earlier. And I'd finish whatever I'd typed that day. And when I finished, the end of that week, I'd finished typing it, doing my second draft, or my first draft of my second draft. And I did a word count. And I sent a very surprised email to Jane and to Jennifer saying, I appear to have accidentally written a novel. And I hope you won't mind. So that was the book. That was at least it doesn't really tell you necessarily what was going on inside my head as things were being written. But that was the circumstances under which the book was written. It was, from my perspective, a very small personal book. And I wasn't expecting the reactions I started to get when I emailed it to people.
So now you've given us the background to it, you must read us some of it, because presumably not many people have yet had a chance to. Although I've seen a few noses buried in it in the last half hour.
We did a signing the other day in Bath, which started at about 9:30 and finished at 1. And there were actually people coming up onto that stage at 1 o'clock in the morning going, "It's really good." Okay, so I'm going to read you a bit that I haven't read before, because it's more fun. We're in chapter 3. Our protagonist, our narrator, has, I should say, although we have a 7-year-old narrator, it's really not really a children's book. It is for adults. But he's gone with his father, he's found their lodger dead at the bottom of the lane, and he's met a young girl called Letty Hempstock, who lives with her mother and her grandmother in the farm, Hempstock Farm, at the end of the lane. And now he's home, and he's sleeping a few days later. He's also won the premium bonds. £25. He's very happy. He's figured out that you can buy an almost infinite number of blackjacks and fruit salads with £25. I don't remember how the dreams started, but that's the way of dreams, isn't it? I know that I was in school and having a bad day, hiding from the kinds of kids who hit me and called me names, but they found me anyway, deep in the rhododendron thicket behind the school, and I knew it must be a dream. But in the dream I didn't know. It was real, and it was true, because my grandfather was there with them, and his friends, old men with grey skin and hacking coughs. They held sharp pencils, the kind that drew blood when you were jabbed with them. I ran from them, but they were faster than I was, the old men and the big boys, and in the boys' toilets where I'd hidden in a cubicle, they caught up with me. They held me down, forced my mouth wide open. My grandfather, but it was not my grandfather. It was really a waxwork of my grandfather, intent on selling me to anatomy, held something sharp and glittering, and he began pushing it into my mouth with his stubby fingers. It was hard and sharp and familiar, and it made me gag and choke, my mouth filled with a metallic taste. They were looking at me with mean, triumphant eyes, all the people in the boys' toilets, and I tried not to choke on the thing in my throat, determined not to give them that satisfaction. I woke, and I was choking. I could not breathe. There was something in my throat, hard and sharp, and stopping me from breathing or from crying out. I began to cough as I woke, tears streaming down my cheeks, nose running. I pushed my fingers as deeply as I could into my mouth, desperate and panicked and determined. I felt the edge of something hard with the tip of my forefinger, put the middle finger on the other side of it, choking myself, clamping the thing between them, and I pulled whatever it was out of my throat. I gasped for breath, and then I half vomited onto my bedsheets, threw up a clear drool flecked with blood from where the thing had cut my throat as I pulled it out. I did not look at the thing. It was tight in my hand, slimy with my saliva and my phlegm. I did not want to look at it. I did not want it to exist, this bridge between my dream and the waking world. I ran down the hallway to the bathroom at the far end of the house. I washed my mouth out, drank directly from the cold tap, spat red into the white sink. Only when I'd done that did I sit on the side of the white bathtub and open my hand. I was scared. But what was in my hand, what had been in my throat, wasn't scary. It was a coin, a silver shilling. I went back to the bedroom. I dressed myself, cleaned the vomit from my sheets as best I could with a damp face flannel. I hoped that the sheets would dry before I had to sleep in the bed that night. Then I went downstairs. I wanted to tell someone about the shilling, but I did not know who to tell. I knew enough about adults to know that if I did tell them what had happened, I would not be believed. Adults rarely seemed to believe me when I told the truth. Anyway, why would they believe me about something so unlikely? My sister was playing in the back garden with some of her friends. She ran over to me angrily when she saw me. She said, "I hate you. I'm telling Mummy and Daddy when they come home." "What?" "You know," she said. "I know it was you." What was me? Throwing coins at us, at all of us, from the bushes. That was just nasty. But I didn't. It hurt. She went back to her friends, and they all glared at me. My throat felt painful and ragged. I walked down the drive. I don't know where I was thinking of going. I just didn't want to be there any longer. Letty Hempstock was standing at the bottom of the drive beneath the chestnut trees. She looked as if she'd been waiting for 100 years and could wait for another 100. She wore a white dress, but the light coming through the chestnut's young spring leaves stained it green. I said, "Hello." She said, "You were having bad dreams, weren't you?" I took the shilling out of my pocket and showed it to her. "I was choking on it," I told her, "when I woke up, but I don't know how it got into my mouth. If someone had put it into my mouth, I would have woken up. It was just in there when I woke." "Yes," she said. "My sister says I threw coins at them from the bushes, but I didn't." "No," she agreed, "you didn't." I said, "Letty, what's happening?" "Oh," she said, as if it was obvious. "Someone's just trying to give people money, that's all. But it's doing it very badly. And it's stirring things up around here that should be asleep, and that's not good." "Is it something to do with the man who died?" "Oh, something to do with him, yes." "Is he doing this?" She shook her head. Then she said, "Have you had breakfast?" I shook my head. "Well then," she said, "come on." We walked down the lane together. There were a few houses down the lane here and there back then, and she pointed to them as we went past. "In that house," said Letty Hempstock, "a man dreamed of being sold and of being turned into money. Now he started seeing things in mirrors." "What kinds of things?" "Himself. But with fingers poking out of his eye sockets, and things coming out of his mouth like crab claws." I thought about people with crab legs coming out of their mouths in mirrors. Why did I find a shilling in my throat? He wanted people to have money. The opal miner who died in the car? Yes, sort of. Not exactly. He started all this off, like someone lighting a fuse on a firework. His death lit the touch paper. The thing that's exploding right now, that isn't him, that's somebody else, something else. She rubbed her freckled nose with a grubby hand. "Lady's gone mad in that house," she told me, and it wouldn't have occurred to me to doubt her. She has money in the mattress. Now she won't get out of bed in case someone takes it from her. "How do you know?" She shrugged. "Once you've been around for a bit, you get to know stuff." I kicked a stone. "By a bit, do you mean a really long time?" She nodded. "How old are you really?" I asked. 11. I thought for a while. Then I asked, "How long have you been 11 for?" She smiled at me. We walked past Caraway Farm. The farmers, whom one day I would come to know as Calliander's parents, were standing in their farmyard, shouting at each other. They stopped when they saw us. When we rounded a bend in the lane and were out of sight, Letty said, "Those poor people." Why are they poor people? Because they've been having money problems. And this morning he had a dream where she was doing bad things to earn money. So he looked in her handbag and found lots of folded up 10-shilling notes. She says she doesn't know where they came from, and he doesn't believe her. He doesn't know what to believe. All the fighting and the dreams, it's about money, isn't it? "I'm not sure," said Letty, and she seemed so grown up then that I was almost scared of her. "What's happening?" she said eventually. can all be sorted out. She saw the expression on my face then, worried, scared even. And she said, after pancakes.
So what's with the money? It's interesting that these sort of monstrous creatures make their entry by giving away money. Is this a sort of anti-capitalist statement?
Not really. I think it had much more to do with how peculiarly important money can be when you're a kid, because you don't actually have an income source. And you get, and I know that I, as a kid, was fascinated with money because I didn't really understand it. You got it from your parents. You know, you could, and sometimes you'd be really lucky and somebody would come to stay, a friend of your dad's, and then they'd actually give you a half a crown or whatever, and you'd have a half a crown. And you'd go, power. I can go into a sweet shop and buy everything I want, or even I can go into a bookshop and buy 2 books. And so I loved the idea of beginning it because we have the suicide, and the suicide is driven by money. And I liked the idea of a creature who was, by its own lights, not evil, trying to do good by people, trying to give people what they wanted at least, giving people money in ways that that possibly were not entirely the best for them. They didn't actually help. So that was really where that began. And then, of course, as the story carried on, I had to find out what it was that was giving them money. And and I created a big sort of, I don't want to give away too much plot because you've got to read the book, but you encounter relatively soon Ursula Monckton. And Ursula Monckton was enormously fun to write because, and she always comes with both names. She's not Ursula or Miss Monckton, she's just Ursula Monckton. Occasionally she's referred to as the thing that called itself Ursula Monckton. But because I love the idea that she was like, it was like Mary Poppins.
Mary Poppins from hell.
Absolutely, but Mary Poppins is always Mary Poppins. She's not Miss Poppins or Mary, she's Mary Poppins. And I thought, okay, if you're doing one of those and making it much darker, and you know, Mary Poppins is basically the sort of beneficent, chthonic god that comes into the Banks children's life. And I thought, well, what happens if the thing that comes into their life is nowhere near as beneficent? And that was the starting point for Ursula Monckton, who is a monster.
Now, I've got a question here, which is about, it's from somebody called Adhamkas, and says, dear Neil, hello Neil, can you tell us something about the different ways you start work on stories for children and stories for adults? And if there's ever a fork in the road where you have to decide which of the two to follow?
What a great question.
It's particularly relevant to this
book.
book.
I think it's absolutely relevant to this one because it wasn't until, when I started it, I had no idea. I wasn't actually categorizing it as children's fiction or adult fiction. I just went, I'm writing a book, this is fun. In fact, I didn't. I went, I'm writing a short story, this is fun. And I didn't have to worry. As it went on, I started to have to actually think about things I'd never thought before in terms of what makes adult fiction, what makes children's fiction. And I would occasionally, in the margins of the notebook in which I was writing, I would leave little notes to myself. I remember writing at one point, I don't actually remember writing it, but I do remember noticing in my handwriting the words, in adult fiction, you're allowed to leave in the boring bits. I'd circled it 3 times. So that was definitely there. And I think one of the things that decided me on the idea that this was adult fiction that I was writing, even more than the material, because you are seeing everything from a child's eyes anyway, was the idea that in children's fiction, I'm perfectly happy to make villains as dark as I like, to make things as dark as I like, but I always feel that a book has to be about hope. It has to be about ways that you can cope with the darkness, ways you can deal with it, and, you know, the quote from G.K. Chesterton that I made up that begins, Coraline, where I say that, you know, fairy tales are not important because they tell you that there are dragons. They're important because they tell you that dragons can be defeated. And that, for me, is the important thing about Coraline. This is not a book necessarily about defeating dragon. It's definitely not a book about telling kids they can be powerful. It's actually a book for adults who have forgotten about the powerlessness of childhood. You have your own wonderful, you have your things that you can do, obviously, but you're also living in a world inhabited by giants. And you've turned up in this place where you didn't even speak the language. And you were definitely not issued an instruction manual or anything when you turned up. And you're just here, and there is this occupying power, and they're enormous. And you can't actually argue with them because they can always pick you up and move you. And so I wanted to try and put that into my story as well. Just one of the things that people have been saying to me about The Ocean at the End of the Lane when they've read it is they'll start telling me about things that they had forgotten about being a child. And that made me ridiculously happy, the idea that there's stuff that you forget just because you don't go there. And then you can read a book where you are taken there, and suddenly bits of your own childhood that you've completely forgotten can come back.
Let's talk a little bit about the farm family, about Letty's family, the Hemstocks. You get an idea from that extract that she's older than she might be for an 11-year-old. Where did they come from? They're sort of, it's a Letty, her mother and her grandmother. They're a family who don't have men. All the men have gone off. And they're sort of, are they witches? What are they?
Well, the Hemstocks began, for me, they actually began when I was about 8 or 9. And somebody, probably my mum, told me that there was a farm down our lane that was mentioned in the Doomsday Book. So it would have been almost 1,000 years old. And I remember just thinking about that, and being a kid, it didn't actually occur to me that 1,000 years ago, the farm would have looked very different. I just assumed that this nice red brick farm had been standing there for about 1,000 years. And then I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if the people who lived there had lived there for 1,000 years? And that thought never quite went away. And by the time I was about 14 or 15, they were called the Hempstock family, and they'd been living in a farm down our lane for about 1,000 years. And they were sort of very old, very magical, and nobody ever noticed them. And I liked that. That sort of sat there. And as I became an adult, I kept expecting to write a story with them in. And a story never actually turned up with them in. So every now and again, when I was writing something else, I'd go, oh, I'll put one of the Hempstocks in it. And so Daisy Hempstock shows up in Stardust. And then when I was writing the Graveyard Book, I put Liza Hempstocks, who's witchy. I thought, good, she's witchy, she'll be in there. And I think looking back on it, what I'd failed to notice about the Hempstocks, and the reason why I never wrote a story with them in, is I had actually never written a story set in my lane before. So suddenly I had the idea of, well, I'll do a story set in the lane. I've got this mini. Obviously, the mini is going to be, there will be the Hempstocks. What are they? Are they witches? No, they're not witches. Somebody asked me last night, the screenwriter of the film of this, or the person who will be writing the script, I met him with, I won't say who he is because I don't know if it's been announced yet, but with Joe Wright, who's going to be directing it. And his first question was, okay, is there anything that I should be researching to understand the hemp stocks better? Is there any myth you can point me at? Is there anything? I'm going, well, no. He said, he was saying, because, you know, are they pagan? What are they? Are they magical pagan things? I'm saying, no. They predate all that. That's newfangled stuff for them, you know. I loved the idea that, you know, old Mrs. Hempstock, who is the oldest of them, remembers the Big Bang. You know, Letty claims that her duck pond is the ocean. And she says they came across it, the ocean, when they came there from the old country. And her mother says that Letty can't really remember properly because the really old country sank beneath the waves. And old Mrs. Hempstock says they're both spring chickens and the really old country blew up. And that's her attitude. And so I loved the idea that they were just very earthy, very practical ladies who had dragged their farm halfway across the universe from the dawn of time, ripping weird stuff up and bringing it with, and plonked it down at the end of the lane that I used to live on. And that's what the Hempstocks are. And they're looking after things. And quite how much they're looking after, you never really know because they don't explain things.
They're certainly keeping bad things out.
They're definitely keeping bad things out. They obviously have a job, and part of their job involves just making sure that bad things that come in get dealt with.
And leading on from that, I've got a question from somebody called Shaggy Dog Story. That Guardian people have names like that. In much of your work, the mythical and the modern merge and conflict. Do you feel myths are still important in modern culture, and why? Or are you creating them, or are you tapping into something? Or
I love myths. I'm a huge myth junkie, and I've loved myths since I was probably about 6 years old. I mean, I may have loved them before, but I remember being given a copy of Roger Lancelin Green's Tales of the Norsemen, in these puffin books, and just going, this is brilliant. This is so much cooler than anything else. And when I got to the story where Loki and Thor and a kid named Thjalfi take refuge for the night in a very peculiar house, which has like 5 branching passages and a big branching passage. They can't really make sense of the geography of it, and then it turns out to have been a giant's glove. It's like, yes, so cool. And then I saved up my own money, and I bought a copy of Roger Lancelin Green's Myths and Tales of Ancient Egypt.
Oh, which appears in the book.
Which appears in the book, and I have that book still, and just loved that, and loved the. Love these animal-headed gods, love those stories. So I've always been fascinated by myths. I've always loved letting them drip and trickle into my fiction. There's a moment in The Ocean at the End of the Lane where our narrator is reading some myths. I think it's the bit where he talks about it. And he says what he likes best about myths is that they aren't for adults and they aren't for children. They just are. And that is still how I feel about them. I can go back and read old myths. I can go back to, these days I don't go back to Roger Lancelin Green. I'll go back to the Prose Edda or the Poetic Edda, but I can still get the same joy and thrill that I did as a kid.
There's another thing that comes up very strongly in the way that you talk about children's books in this, is that they've got huge violent backstories, haven't they? I mean, the character says he loves the books about Egypt because it's about animal-headed gods who cut each other up and then restored each other to life.
It's definitely part of the fun of myths is nobody is particularly sugarcoating anything for anyone. And kids love terrible things happening. You know, it's that point where the terrifying satisfaction on the face of a kid where something really awful happens to a bad person at the end of the story, it's like, yes. And you're reading like Grimm's fairy tales, and the queen was meant, they put iron shoes, they heated until she was red hot, and then they clamped them on her foot, and they made her dance until she died. And kids are going, yes. And then I think it's only when you become an adult and you start going, oh, that's not really very nice. And maybe they should have talked to her. But no, one of the things, I loved the fact that children's books run all the way through this book. And my publishers actually got in touch with me at one point because they wanted to make sure that any permissions had been gotten for the quotes from classic children's books that I have in the book, and I had to admit that I'd made them up. There's actually it was wonderful. I just got to, when I was a kid, I read everything. Absolutely, anything that I could find, anything lying around, I would read it. But we had all of my mum's books. In fact, my mother and my aunt wrote it, all of their books. And so I would read them too. And I would read all these books by people like Angela Brazil, and books about, girls who could not leave their ponies when the Nazis came and had to stay. And I got to make up some of those in this book where he goes off to read them. So that was enormously fun. There's a point where you get Sandy, who has been sent off by an administrative error because she's Sandy, I-E, rather than Sandy with a Y, and has gone off to the wrong school, but it's all worked out very well because she has discovered that her geography teacher is a Bolshevik spy. It's great.
But there is a difference between your main character in this and those main characters, in that your main character is powerless. He doesn't fight the good fight and win, whereas the classic thing is that they do.
Absolutely. And he does. I'm very proud of my lead character in this.
Who doesn't have a name, which makes him difficult to talk about.
It doesn't make it easy, difficult to read, of course, because you're just looking out through his eyes. And none of his family have names. They're all just sort of defined in relationship to him. There's his father, his mother, his sister. And then there are the characters with names. And the characters with names and when characters pop on, you'll get a doctor and you'll get a policeman and stuff. But characters with names tend to be Hempstocks or... but no, it's true. He screws up a lot. Several of the things he does actually cause more bad things to happen. He, at one point, he gets himself into deeper trouble. He does escape. I'm very proud of his escape, because he climbs down a drain pipe. He's learned to climb down drain pipes because kids in books climb down drain pipes, and he feels he has an obligation.
And you make that point, don't you? It's not a plastic drain pipe like we have today. It's a good old solid drain pipe. And there's another point you make about, I was really interested in the way you build your own history into it. Another thing you say, it's the oddest thing is that we used to have gas fires in rooms. It's much odder than a ghost turning up in your room.
That was, I think, because I was writing the book, I'm sitting there writing it, and I'm going, well, okay, if this thing had happened to him, he would now be drying off. If he was in the bedroom, and I kept the geography very much of the house and of the grounds. I play with it a bit because it's fiction, I move things around, but basically it's pretty factual. And I thought, well, if he did that, he would have done what I would have done. I would have gone into the bedroom, I would have lit a match, lit that gas fire, and dried off in front of that gas fire. It's really weird, the idea that you'd have a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old with their own gas fire. Which is kind of dangerous, actually. And in fact, looking back on it, I had that pair of red pajamas that had that huge hole in there from where I burnt the thing and somehow managed not to drip burning plastic from nylon pajamas that caught fire from that fireplace onto anything except the... And I thought, that actually seems more unlikely than anything else that I have written so far. And there's been some really weird stuff in this book, and I put that in. And it's true, it's just the sort of thing you wouldn't do today. Wouldn't happen.
It wouldn't happen at all. No, you'd be ruled out. I mean, you could. The interesting
I'm
thing.
sure that health and safety people would turn up at your house with clipboards.
So you can write horrific things. You can write about horrific things as long as they're in the realm of the imagination. But as soon as it involves reality,
It actually caught me up short. You know, it was funny, and I would not want anybody to think that my parents were in any way not, you know, looking after it. This was just how it was. It was a house. It had a gas fire. It was a children's bedroom. So yes, I'm very good at fictional. When you get real, you suddenly go, oh, that's really weird.
I'm going to ask 2 more questions, and then the mics are going to start going round. So have we got the mics out? Just want to make sure. And the usher's going to stick your hands up, because that's how I'm going to know. You have to stick your hands up, so I know who's asking the question. So make sure you stick your hands up quickly, so that we don't waste any time. And these 2 questions.
Hang on, I'm confused. Are the ushers going to put their hands up, or the
ushers,
people?
No. Yes. In fact, the idea was yes, the ushers are going to put their hands up, because otherwise we're not going to be able to see.
Got it. So people with questions will put their hands up. Ushers with mics will find them,
Yeah.
and then put their hands up.
And they put their hands up. And then I'm going to ask questions in between, so that we don't waste time while the mics thread along the row. And one question is from somebody of the Royal Society of Literature who's called Sarah L. White, and she says that you relay the fantasies and fears of children so well. Are you going to do any new picture books?
I've got a new book. It's very, very weird. I have 2 books coming out within a period of about 2.5 months. When you sign up for author school, rule number 1 that they teach you after, you know, put full stops at the end of sentences and be nice to your editor, is, and whatever you do not have an adult book and a children's book coming out within a couple of months, because you will do nothing but promote books for half a year. So I have Ocean at the End of the Lane coming out now. And then I have a book called Fortunately, the Milk, which comes out in September, which is, and the peculiar thing, almost to the point where it seems like it was intentional, which it really wasn't, is the books are like mirror images of each other. Ocean at the End of the Lane is a book framed by an adult recounting what happened to him when he was a child. It's probably my darkest book. In some ways, definitely in a few scenes, the most disturbing book. It's definitely not reassuring. And then you've got Fortunately the Milk, which is the single silliest book I've ever written. It's bookended by a kid, but it had an adult hero who also doesn't have a name. And it's about milk. It's about these kids, their mum has gone off to a conference to talk about lizards, and she's left them and their dad, and they're out of milk. So dad goes off to the corner shop to get milk and come back with milk. And he takes rather a while. And when he shows up, they say, you got talking to one of your friends. He's like, no, I didn't. They say, what happened? He says, well, good question. Glad you asked me that. And explains how he was just leaving the corner shop when he was beamed up to an alien spaceship, where these big, globby green aliens explained that they were going to redecorate the planet and needed his permission. And he escapes from them and is picked up by pirates. There's a door saying, you know, space-time continuum, please keep out. And he goes in. And he is rescued from this 18th century pirate ship by a stegosaurus in a hot air balloon who has traveled, and the stegosaurus rather frustratingly keeps insisting it is in the distant future, which the father thinks is complete nonsense because they're obviously 200 years in the past. And after that, things get really weird. And there are ponies, there are vampires, proper ponies with like sparkly stars on the side of them. And there's a volcano god. It's incredibly well read. There are piranha, sort of. There's all sorts of weirdness, and it's very funny. It's the funniest, silliest thing. And when it was done, we gave it to Chris Riddell. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with Chris Riddell's art. He's absolutely wonderful, really funny. And he just went barking mad on this. And took this book and did at least one illustration on every page. And it's just wonderful. And so fortunately the Milk comes out in September. And that will be the next children's book. But you never really write. I'm never quite convinced that I'm writing children's books for children alone, because I remember when I had kids, if you've got a children's book, you will be reading it to them.
This actually brings us to the next question, which is from the Go Now, which is, as a parent, writer, reader, how would you or did you shape your children's imagination through stories? You've sort of answered that, haven't you? You just do weird.
No, I used to always read to them. I would read them stuff that I'd loved. I'd make sure, I sort of went, you cannot be literate without me having read you the Narnia books and the Mary Poppins books and The Hobbit and things like that. So I would do all of that stuff. Diana Wynne Jones. And then I'd also follow their own tastes. Mike liked things that were more adventure-y. Holly, I completely messed up on Holly. Holly, my daughter Holly is now 27. She has not yet forgiven me for this. And I will tell this story as an advisory. Do not make my mistake. When your 11-year-old daughter shows you an R.L. Stine Goosebumps book and says, these are great, do not go, wow, if you like that, I've got something for you. Go down to your library and give her a copy of Carrie. Holly spent the entire rest of her childhood only reading books in which people went over the prairies on covered wagons and grew things and were very nice to each other. And she still glares at me if ever Stephen King's name is mentioned. Do not do this.
Okay, so now I think it's time to bring in the audience, and it's your chance to talk about all the other books that you want to talk about. So who's going to ask the first question? Be brave. Yes, there's somebody there, and there's some people over there. So So will the ushers stick your hand up when you've got the mic to somebody? Yeah. Okay, we've got there.
I just want to ask, did Holly ever get to meet Stephen King?
Has Holly ever met Stephen King? No, she hasn't. I've only met Steve a few times. It was never with family. The first time I met Stephen King, I was doing a signing for a Sandman collection called Season of Mists in Boston. And Steve and his family, including the incredibly young Joe Hill, turned up at the signing to invite me to dinner and were very surprised to discover that this thing had been going on for several hours and the line was still around the block. And I wound up eventually going to his hotel room and having dinner off room service in the floor of their suite about 11 o'clock at night when the signing was done. And I got the very best advice from Stephen King that I never followed. It was the best advice. And I look back on it now and people say, what's the best piece of advice you ever got? And apart from the thing I got from when they say, what's the best piece of advice from a writer you ever got? And apart from the thing I got from Harlan Ellison on how if you have, like I do, fairly tough stubble and fairly sensitive skin, you should rub conditioner on your beard and leave it for about 5 minutes before you shave, and then you can shave real easily, which, I've got to say, best piece of advice ever. That one at least I acted on. The best piece of advice I ever got from a writer that I didn't act on was Stephen King in that room saying, what you've got going on here with Sandman, with these amazing people who will come out and they will sign for you and what you're doing right now, It's fantastic. You should enjoy this. And I didn't. I worried. I was sort of vaguely nervous. I was convinced that sometime in the next week it would all go away. Continually, always. And I was worried about the next deadline, and I was worried about whether I would be able to write tomorrow, and I was worried about where ideas would come from. And I worried. And I actually really only stopped worrying about 4 or 5 years ago. I think I stopped worrying about the point I won the Newbery Medal. And I went, oh, this thing really is real. It doesn't matter if the fraud police turn up at my house tomorrow and say, we're taking this all away, because I've got the Newbery Medal. And that will scare them away, because the fraud police are terrified of Newbery medals, in my head.
I've got a Sandman question here from Angry Irish Punk, who asks, did you have any idea what an impact it would have when you were writing it?
When I started Sandman, I had one goal, and one goal only, which was to last my year. Because in the days of, those far back days of about 1987, I think, I signed the contract for Sandman. Back then, when DC Comics would do a new comic, it was a point of honor for them to do 12 issues. That's no longer true, and it wasn't true before that, but around that time it happened to be true. And so I really wanted to be just successful enough that they would allow me to do my year. And when I plotted the first Sandman story, I made it 8 issues long. And I made it 8 issues long because I knew that at issue 8 would be the point where I would get the phone call saying, well, it's a minor critical success, but it's not actually selling anything. So we're going to go to issue 12, can you stop? And I would write 4 short stories and then stop. And I had a few ideas for short stories. Only when I got to issue 8, we were selling more copies than any comparable comic had sold in decades. So I carried on. It never felt at the time, I loved what I was doing, but it never felt like I was doing anything particularly earth-shattering because I didn't really see it changing things. What I think I'd failed to notice was that you know, the people who would read it and change things and do stuff were still reading it. It wasn't like, you know, a lot of them were still at school or still at university or whatever, and they were going to come along later. But no, it's one of those wonderful things to have done in retrospect. I think if I'd thought it was big and clever and important while it was going on, it probably wouldn't have been anywhere near as good. And I certainly wouldn't have written it as fast or as comfortably. I'm currently driving my poor editors in America absolutely mad and sad at the same time. Can you drive people sad?
I'm sure you can.
I think I can. By just being incredibly slow on this Sandman story that I'm doing for the 25th anniversary. And one of the reasons why it's incredibly slow is I will write a scene, and while I'm writing, I'm picturing the 30 million people who have read Sandman over the years looking over my shoulders, going, so what, we waited 16 years for that? And then I go, oh, and I... So.
Let's have someone from up the top. We've got a question up the top.
You've already kind of answered a bit of this, but with regards to the Sandman project, yes, there's the 25th anniversary. Was that the key factor in saying, I've got the story and I want to tell it now? Or were there other things that said, this story has to be told at this time now?
No, it was the only story that when I finished Sandman 1 through to 75, there was a big chunk of a thing that hadn't been told. And not huge, it was just there'd never been an opportunity to tell it. It hadn't actually fitted in. And at the beginning of Sandman #1, Morpheus, a.k.a. Dream, is captured by some essentially hedge wizards, and they capture him because he's absolutely exhausted. He's come from a very long way, and he's shattered. And you never found out why. And occasionally I'd allude to this, but you never found out why. And it was a story, and I knew why, but I hadn't told it. And as we were approaching Sandman's 20th anniversary, they came to me, DC Comics, said, would you like to do another Sandman story? And I said, absolutely, I have this thing. The shorthand name for it has always been Sandman Zero, just because it was the thing that came before Sandman 1, although the real title of it is something else. And so I said I would love to do this, and they said, great. So you'll be doing it on the same rates and terms that you signed up for in 1987, 20 years ago. And I said, hang on, look, I don't want to be grumpy here, and I'm obviously not doing this for the money, but I don't know if you've noticed, I'm now a best-selling novelist, and all of those Sandmans that we did have all sold millions of graphic novels ever, and they're all in print, and can we improve my rate from what it was in 1987? And they said, we can't do that. If we did that for you, we'd have to do it for everybody. And I said, then, no. And a few years later, things changed at DC Comics. And the new people came to me and they said, that Sandman Zero thing, are you still interested in doing it? I said, well, yeah, but not under the terms that I signed up for in 1987. You actually do have to, you don't have to improve things to the level of something like this, but just so that I don't feel ashamed of doing it. And they said, okay. And so I started. And J.H. Williams is drawing it, and it's beautiful, and it's brilliant, and I get to ask him, he's really fun, because I'm getting to ask him to do things that I think are impossible. And then he draws them. And that one of those things was, and I don't think I've said anything about Sandman Zero, so I will tell this one little thing, seeing that I'm here now, why not? On first couple of pages, you actually get to, we've seen various different versions of Morpheus over the years. In the first couple of pages, we get to meet him as a flower and as a plant. And I got to ask J.H. Williams to draw Morpheus, draw Dream, as a plant. Just as a flower, basically, with some... And I said, can you make the leaves sort of look a bit like a cloak? And stuff. And he did. It's amazing. You look at it and go, that's what he would look like if he was flower. Sort of white petals, and somehow they look like a face, and I'm not even quite sure how. So it's enormously fun.
Okay, just before we go off Sandman and open it up to the floor again, somebody called Fergal says, personally, I've never been more affected by a comic series than Sandman, so thank you very much for the utterly compelling sense of dread towards the end. Leading on from that, with a very lame question, no, Fergal, it's okay. What's your favourite comic arc?
My favourite comic arc, I think, if we're actually going for specific arcs of specific comics, probably the Swamp Thing American Gothic arc still. And it would be that one because I just remember reading it as a 23, 24-year-old and going, everything I thought you could do in comics, that when I would tell teachers, when I would tell people, I think you can do this in comics, everything I thought you could do in comics, it's true, you can. You can tell stories that are as powerful and as affecting as anything out there in literature, in film, in theatre. Watching Alan Moore and his artistic collaborators telling horror stories about America that were somehow good horror stories, pretty good social commentary, and also somehow made a story about a giant, shambling, 7-foot-high lump of moss into effective, heart-rending tales was absolutely remarkable. And that, I think, And there are other things that I could point to that I think are better. If your question is what's the best art, they will be different. But what's my favorite? It would probably still be American Gothic.
Very good. We'll have something from the background there. Lots of hands wiggling around up there.
Hello. Did you always know you were going to be like a cross-genre author doing comic books and novels and children's stuff, or was it a happy accident?
Oh, great question. Don't think anyone's ever asked precisely that before. Well, when I was a kid, I definitely wanted to be a writer, but I thought I was going to grow up to be... actually, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a writer, but that seemed mythical and impossible. And you couldn't get there from there. So I think, well, I'll probably grow up to be an English teacher, because I've met English teachers. They were good. So I was like, maybe I'll be one of those. Maybe I could be one of those sort of things that looks like it's fun on television, like a barrister, because they have wigs. And they get laughs. But I think I wanted to grow. I expected to either grow up to be the kind of fantasy writer who has maps in the front of their books, or the kind of hard science fiction writer who's writing genuinely sort of clinky science fiction, Larry Niven kind of stuff, Discworld things, not here on Earth. So that was what I thought when I was a teenager. When I was in my early 20s, I was a journalist. And I interviewed a lot of authors. And talking to those authors, not actually normally during the interview itself, but afterwards, when you go down to the pub for a drink and you're just chatting with them. And these were best-selling people. These were big, important people. And I was not. I was a nobody journalist. But they would tell me about how they all had a novel they couldn't really get published. It would be a French Revolution novel, or something about steamships, something like that. And I would... And they couldn't get it published because it would be very different from whatever it was they were famous for. And their publishers just really didn't like the idea. Maybe it might eventually be published under a pen name or something, or published by a small press. But they would talk about the fact that there were things they could not get published. And even as a 23, 24-year-old journalist, I was going, no, that's not going to happen to me. I'm not going to be that thing. I want to do everything. And partly it's because I didn't really have a career plan. What I had was a list. And I'd drawn up my list when I was about 15. I showed it to my mum, who said it was a very good list. And it had all of the things I wanted to do on it, including, write a book, write an episode of Doctor Who. And it felt like I wanted to be able to do write comics was on it. And I wanted to do the things on my list. And then, once I'd started writing comics, I got completely spoiled, because comics is a medium that people mistake for a genre. People assume that comics is a genre, and it's not, it's just a medium. So in Sandman, I could do horror, or contemporary, or historical. Over in Miracle Man, Mark Buckingham and I were doing a different genre every episode. There was, one was a thing called Winter's Tale, which was just a children's story, and we did spy stories, utopian fiction of all kinds. And at the point where I was done for the first round with comics, I thought, okay, I have had complete power. I'm never giving that up. And I really was very, very serious about that. In fact, one reason why originally the first 3 novels that I planned to write were Neverwhere and Stardust, and a book called Time in the Smoke, which is all about the city of London and time. And Neverwhere happened, and then Stardust happened, and then I thought, hang on, I can't actually, if I write another book that's sort of set in London and has all this stuff, I'm going to be that bloke who writes those London books. And that was right, American Gods. Nothing like those two, and it's going to be big, and it's going to be this. And there was this determination, in the words of Noel Coward, I believe, never to pop out of the same hole twice. And what's lovely now is I have a fantastic publisher. I have two fantastic publishers. I have so many fantastic publishers. But what's great about my publishers is pretty much anything I give them, they would publish. And nobody's ever going to say, well, we can't really do that. It's not really a Neil Gaiman book. They're perfectly used to and perfectly sanguine with and perfectly happy with the idea that Neil Gaiman books are absolutely identifiable because they're written by me and they have my name on the cover. And when I finished American Gods, there was a publisher who tried to woo me away from Headline. And they were offering much, or at least a couple of those muches, more money than Headline were offering. And there was sort of, but they made the mistake of sending a letter along with this, your contract with Headline is up, please come to us, offer, where they explained that actually they were going to make me the commercial success that Headline hadn't. And the way that they were going to do this was they saw that American Gods was a really good thing and very successful. It had potential. So they would train me to write books just like American Gods, only a little bit less weird. And I would write books like that in future. American Gods 2, British Gods. And they would be able to guarantee that I would be a huge successful author, and that was why they were going to offer me all this money to leave Headline. And I just thought, that's my idea of hell. I want to be the kind of author who can write Coraline next if I want. Or I want to be the kind of, it is gloriously unlikely that I can have The Ocean at the End of the Lane come out and get the wonderful reviews it's getting and be taken really seriously, and it's going to be, a book at bedtime, and it's this deep, dark adult book, and I can have a book with a time-traveling stegosaurus in a hot air balloon. And people aren't confused, or if they are, they don't stay confused for very long. But I'm allowed, and that, I think, is the best thing about being an author.
Do we have someone from down here? Got someone on the left-hand side?
Hi. It's clear your childhood love of Doctor Who has inspired you to create episodes and contribute to the kind of great pantheon of Doctor Who episodes. Is there anything you've seen later on in life or at the moment, any other kind of pre-existing franchises that you would think of writing something for and contributing to? Anything that inspires you?
The thing that is magic about Doctor Who, which is not true of, as far as I can think of, any other franchises, is it's the same show that I watched when I was 3. I watched Doctor Who from behind the sofa at my grandma's house in Southsea. I got my dad to buy me a copy of Dalek World, the Dalek World Annual, on Victoria Station in about 1965, maybe 66. I've still got it. It doesn't have a cover, but I've still got it. And it has this glorious sense of continuity. Part of the joy for me of getting to write Doctor Who, we were talking about myth before, and my love of myths, which started when I was about 6. But before I knew who the Norse gods were, I knew what Daleks were. and I knew where they came from. And I knew what TARDIS stood for. And, you know, by the time I got my copy of Dalek World, and I was reading these important things that you had to know about Daleks, did you know that measles is a Dalek disease? So if you've had measles, you have had a Dalek disease. And Daleks cannot see the color red. Think about that for a moment. Because there have been red Daleks. And it must have been really weird for the other Daleks, because they'd be going, oh my God, did you see that? There's just like these Dalek bumps going along in the air. So,
Measles,
anyway,
in fact, in reverse.
possibly giant measles. So, I getting to write Doctor Who was actually like being God. You know, I think supreme power comes the moment that you get to go interior TARDIS. And whatever I make him say, he'll say. I can have the thing go up and down in the middle, and it'll go up and down. Power. And I don't think there's anything out there that is like that. Possibly, possibly classic Star Trek, now rebooted as not classic Star Trek. But even that doesn't have that same, thing of going all the way back to my childhood. And going all the way back into infancy, which Doctor Who really does. I remember it being at Mrs. Pepper's little pre-kindergarten school, and we got, who here is old enough to remember those third of a pint of milk things? Some hands go up of old people like me. Good. So you used to get these little bottles of milk. They were third of a pint. And I just remember we used to drink, first of all, you drink all your milk, then there'd be a little bit of milk in the bottom, and you'd blow into it. It would bubble. Having done that and got all the fun you could possibly get out of bubbling a little bit of milk, you would then bend the straw over so it looked a little bit like an eye stalk, and you'd go, exterminate.
So we'll have one from the top and then one from down here. Have we got one from the top?
Your instruction that people who suffer misfortune should make good art has taken on a life of its own that you probably couldn't have expected. How do you feel about that, first of all? And if anyone in this room should suffer a misfortune, such as their cat exploding or their husband running off with a politician, if they do go on to make good art, how will they know that it has been good? What should it mean for them?
He's in the back of the stalls.
Oh, yes, there you were.
They did it in reverse.
That's
another Gaiman trope.
So, first of all, I love the fact that the Make Good Art speech became this fantastic thing, and it's gone off and become viral. It was given by somebody who basically makes art to the graduating class of the University of the Arts in Philadelphia. And since it's been given, people have occasionally come up to me and said, it applies outside of the arts. They said, I'm a physicist. Make good physics. Make good architecture. I'm going, that's cool, absolutely, that stands. I think, for me, art is always, or almost always, my way of dealing with things. It's my way of figuring out what I think about things. It's my way of taking things that upset me, confuse me, that I want to figure out, want to deal with. Sometimes want to just sort of put far enough away that I can inspect it from all sides. I'm definitely not somebody who writes to tell people what I think about something. I'm somebody who writes to find out what I think about something, which is very different. So I'm enormously proud that speech went out there and that people who are not artists feel it applies to them. In terms of what make good art is and whether you should do it and how you know you're doing it, I think in many ways you get to define good in that sentence. I don't get to do it for you. And originally I was just saying, make art. And then I thought, no, actually I want to try and get people to aspire to something. I'm not saying just draw. I'm saying draw, make good art, channel it, try and push yourself. Go somewhere with this that you're not necessarily going. And some people have come up to me and they say, well, can you make bad art? I'm going, yes, absolutely. Make bad art. That's making good art too. How can bad mean good? I don't know. Make good art, find out. So, yes.
Lady upstairs.
Coming back to all the forms your work has taken, will we ever see a truly interactive Neil Gaiman book? An electronic interactive book?
I don't know. You may well, at some point relatively soon, because I have actually started just playing around with something, get something a little bit game-like out of me. It's quite possible that, and actually I'm working on something with Eddie Campbell and a string quartet in Australia called the 4-Play String Quartet to create, yes, it is a pun. There are 4 of them, they play. What, like it has another meaning? Strange people. So the 4-Play String Quartet, and we are doing a version of a short story that I wrote called The Truth is a Cave in the Black Mountains, and that Eddie has illustrated, and it's coming out in a sort of cool, it'll come out in a physical printed version, but there will be an electronic version with all sorts of wonderful extra things like music in it. But I do think that it's quite possible that somewhere down the line I would actually go, this would be a really interesting thing to do in a form that's much more fluid than just paper and pages and words, and I might do that. But on the other hand, what I love about fiction, and particularly about prose fiction, is that there is a level of amazing interactivity going on. But it's just not visible, because I am coming up with a story, and then I'm taking that story and reducing it to 26 letters and a handful of punctuation marks, which are in essence raw code. And then I'm handing them to you, and you are compiling that code and using it to build words, build walls, build characters, build whole worlds. Things happen, giant adventures, and all you're doing is taking those 26 letters and a handful of punctuation marks. And you're doing it. And there is a glorious interactivity, I think, to that should never be overlooked.
I think we've got time for one more. Who's it going to be? Someone, you've been underrepresented in the middle block, so somebody at the back of the middle block.
Hi there. Just two-part question, really. First of all
You can't do a two-part question. It's the last question.
Second's worth it.
That's cheating. Okay, do it.
First of all, Neverwhere. Have we got anything coming? Is there any stories coming? And second part, which is what I think everyone wants to know, does the time-travelling Stegosaurus have a name, and what is it?
Good two-part question. Neverwhere. So, as many of you may know, BBC Radio 4 and Radio 4 Extra did this fantastic audio adaptation for radio of Neverwhere earlier this year, done by Dirk Maggs and Heather Lama, starring Benedict Cumberbatch and James McAvoy, Natalie Dormer, Sir Christopher Lee, and everybody else. And I heard it way before it was broadcast, and I just went, this is so good. I want to go back there. And I'd been asked to write a story by Gardner Dozois and George R.R. Martin for an anthology they were doing called Rogues. And I went, right, the time is right. And I wrote a short story, about 10,000 words, probably technically a novelette, called How the Marquis Got His Coat Back, that I've been meaning to write for a long time. So that'll be published sometime next year. And it was really fun going back. You get to meet the shepherds of Shepherd's Bush. They are really scary. The elephant of Elephant and Castle. Not as scary as the shepherds, but pretty damn scary. And you get to find out how the Marquis got his coat back, and also some of the ways of why the Marquis is the way that he is. So I got to write that, and that's out there. Sooner or later, I very much hope, within the next 5 years or so, I will get up one morning and go, I should write that Neverwhere novel. And I will write The Seven Sisters, which is the next Neverwhere novel. You get to meet, you get to learn the names of another two of the Seven Sisters and how the Marquis got his coat back. And the Stegosaurus is, I'm afraid, just Professor Steg.